Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, Week in Review, 7 stories from the American Revolution. I am just getting situated because just as I was about to start going, I realized, I left my air conditioner on, so I had to run over and turn that off and run right back. And now I was all ready to go, but got myself nice and flustered just before we start. Thank you for coming. Let me know you're here. If you have any questions, this is the time to do it. I'm going to be recapping the 7 founders of the previous week, both articles and videos, which are now both one and the same. I will note it's only 6 this week because it's been a crazy week. I've messed up a bunch of times. You'd think the week of 4th of July, I'd be right on my game. But no, of course, I scheduled one for a few days late last Friday. So the next, we're not going to be doing the Anti-Federalist week. The Federalist Farmer number 3 is being released tomorrow morning. It's already recorded and set up. I've also we've had a bunch of storms come through. We've had problems with power going out, things like that. I'm not here to complain or waste your time. I'm just giving you the update. So, anyway, let's start talking about the American Revolution. Because there's a weird space next to me here until I pull someone up. There you go. We're going with this model today where the person's right there next to me instead of the screen and screen. Let me know if you like the screen and screen better or the hangout here like I'm doing a newscast. I just want to make it as convenient for you as possible. So Johnny Dunlop, this weekend was 4th of July. Again, you'd think I'd be more on my game for 4th of July, but this weekend was the 4th of July. Happy belated 4th of July. I did wish you 4th of July earlier in the week, but either way, thanks for coming. You'd think on a big week like that for this channel, I'd be much better about it, but I did release an article about John Dunlop. Dunlop is fairly famous for the Dunlop broadsides. The Dunlop broadsides are the first printing of the Declaration of Independence. Yes, the Declaration of Independence. As for Dunlop, he in 1757 was just 10 years old when he was sent to America, the British North America. His parents put this young Irish boy on a ship and sent him to another world. Luckily, his uncle was already there, and he goes to Philadelphia, where he apprentices to his uncle as a printer, and he learns the printing trade in Philadelphia, where that was the cool thing to be if you were an American founder. Now, Dunlop, while he's there, when the Revolutionary War breaks out, Dunlop does join the cause. He fights with the Patriots. Very briefly, he joins the Pennsylvania militia and joins the early New Jersey campaign, notably the Trenton-Princeton times. But after that, he returns very quickly to his print shop. Like many founders, he had a business to run. He couldn't necessarily donate all of his life to a war. Especially the militiamen were not professional soldiers. They were people of the towns that were ready to fight, not at a moment's notice like the Minutemen up north, but ready to fight if the Native Americans came calling, or the French, or the Spanish, or one of many other nations who could at any time invade Philadelphia or any like city. So he does come back and he joins his print shop, and it's pretty good he does, because he gets a government contract. And if you think government contracts are a new thing, no, they existed before there was even a government. Because the Continental Congress wasn't technically a government, especially before the Declaration of Independence. But he won this quasi-government contract to print all publications for the Continental Congress. Therefore, when the Continental Congress voted for independence and subsequently ratified the Declaration of Independence, well, they gotta have the printer they've contracted with to go out and print that contract. And that's what they did. They give it to Johnny Dunlop over here. John Dunlop prints it up, prints about 200 copies, though we're not entirely sure exactly how many copies he actually printed, but we are under the impression it's approximately 200. Now, we also understand, and this is not verified either, but it's certainly, there are certain papers that imply that Ben Franklin pops by and Thomas Jefferson pop by. Not necessarily at the same time, but over the course of the night. Dunlop stays up all night printing the Declaration of Independence. And when we say the Declaration of Independence, this is usually the one we're subconsciously referring to. There is another one that's printed the following month that they actually sign. Truth be told, it's the one they sign that I think most people refer to as the Declaration of Independence, but we're thinking July 4th, 1776. So it's a little bit of split between the one that's signed and the Dunlop broadsides, as they are called. The Dunlop broadside is just a gigantic piece of paper. You've seen the Declaration of Independence. It's big. It's big. I can't fit my hands on screen. It's bigger than my screen. And I should do it on this side. There we go. Right here. And a broadside, just a gigantic piece of paper. And he prints, as I said, 200 of these. Now, it's interesting. Thomas Jefferson stops by, apparently, at one point, which Jefferson had just written what he considered a very beautiful piece of penmanship, not the actual, but a beautiful work. And then he sat for 2 days and listened to the Continental Congress debate and destroy it, in his opinion, cutting out approximately a fourth of the document, including, interestingly enough, a passage blaming the king for slavery. And it's often said that this was removed because the southern states didn't want to attack slavery, which to a degree is true, but a more important point regarding the removal of the slavery thing is there have been slaves in North America for 150 years, and there had been slaves in the Americas for almost 250 years. So as far back as the American founders were to us right now, that's how far back it was that slavery started in North America. So to blame the King of England for something that had been going on for hundreds of years, when he had only been King of England for like 12 years at that point, that was a stretch. And that's really why they took it out. They're like, come on, man, like, Thomas, come on. As I said in the live stream the other day, the Declaration of Independence, as with all political writings, did have certain tones of propaganda to it. It's not a word they used at the time, but it is what it was. And that was just too much. They were basically said to him, hey, like, we have to be realistic about what we're saying here. Anyway, got a little off topic. Back to Dunlap. He's given these broadsides. So Thomas Jefferson, after 2 days of watching his beautiful document mangled in his eyes, he goes and oversees Dunlap printing. That couldn't have been great. And Benjamin Franklin, who himself is the most famous printer of colonial times, comes in his hometown of Philadelphia nonetheless. So Dunlap is technically a competitor of Benjamin Franklin, who's been in Europe for 20 years, comes back for a year and a half, and is now overseeing Dunlap work. Probably pretty stressful. Now, he does a successful job, and these copies are sent out to each state. They are sent to several nations of Europe. They're sent to George Washington, who has them read in front of the Continental Army, inspiring billions of soldiers. That's an overestimation, of course, but inspiring the army. Now, he prints these up, and as I said, he does continue printing for the Continental Congress. He does continue that. However, he eventually, about 2.5 years later, prints the announcement that the French, in response to, among other things, the campaign of Saratoga, the French have decided to join the Americans in the fight. Here's the thing, though. That was insider information, and while the founders would go on to be very much about freedom of speech, they wanted to keep that secret, not necessarily for themselves, but to protect the French, so the French could take their time amassing their army and navy and getting everything underway. And because he prints this, so Dunlap is actually the one who announces to the world that the French have joined the Americans in the fight, which, Dunlap, hey Nick, how's it going, man? If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for coming. We're just talking about John Dunlap. Dunlap, as I said, is famous for printing the Dunlap broadsides, the first Declarations of Independence, first 200 copies or so. But unfortunately, he also accidentally tells the world that the French have joined the American cause. And because of this, the Continental Congress, they decide to cut ties with him when it comes to that fat government contract they had handed out to him. Unfortunately for him, so he does lose that contract. The Continental Congress, now technically a government of sorts, even though they haven't ratified the Articles of Confederation. So his quasi-government contract did become a government contract, and then it's terminated. Hi, Ashley. Thank you so much for coming. So, anywho, Dunlap goes on, and he continues his career and ends up being a pretty successful printer. And he also ends up printing he ends up, I believe he prints an early copy of the Constitution. Yes. Oh, he ends up years later being the first person to publish a copy of the United States Constitution. Now, the United States Constitution was handed out to several people to publish all at once because they wanted to get it out there, because they wanted people to read it and get it ratified right quick. And Dunlap, being right there in Philly, gets one of the first copies. And my understanding is he's the first one to actually get it printed and out to the public. Now, again, there were a bunch of people in Philly, printed them all at once. Did he print one copy and put it out there and then print more? And while other people printed 400 and he printed 100, something like that. That's tough. That's tough to determine, to say the least. But he is not only the guy who printed the Declaration first, but printed the Constitution first, and as I said, announced French participation in the war. Now, Dunlap becomes really successful, not just as a printer, but he actually invests in a lot of land, and land speculation was a great way for wealthy merchants in the 1780s to go bankrupt in the 1790s. Dunlap, for his part, did a very good job and retired successfully at just the age of 50, and is able to live a comfortable life for the rest of his days. Nick, how many copies of the Declaration still exist? That's a great question. You know what? I'm going to look that up. Declaration of Independence copies in existence. I'm Googling it. I know I should know things like this, Nick. That's why you come here. But that's a great question, and I don't know. From constitutionfacts.com, only 25 Dunlap broadsides are still known to exist. The last one sold in 2000 for $8 million. So if you got some $8 million hanging around, there it is, Nick. Grab yourself a copy of the 25 copies of the Declaration. Now, as I was saying earlier, there were several different broadsides. Declaration of Independence broadsides, because these were the Dunlap broadsides. There was another one printed very shortly after, which I'm going to try and look up on the fly here. And then there was also the Mary Catherine Goddard publication, which I think also counted as broadsides. But I am not 1,000% sure. Okay, Wikipedia I happened on has actually 26 copies of the Declaration of Independence still in existence. 3 of them in the UK. Well, I guess we sent a bunch there. And then the Goddard broadsides, right, which Mary Catherine Goddard, we talked about in our live stream the other day. Mary Catherine Goddard was a woman who ran a publishing company. She's the first one to publish the names of the people the following January, the actual names of the signers. And then it's Matlack. That's right. The Matlack Declaration is the one that was actually engrossed on parchment, as they say. Timothy Matlack had really fancy handwriting and had friends in Congress and was in Philadelphia, and they had him actually, the copy, I was saying earlier, when we think of the Declaration of Independence, what we envision is the Matlack Declaration, where the nice fancy penmanship that they all signed underneath. But we also think 4th of July. When we think 4th of July, we're thinking of the Dunlap broadside. So we're thinking of some weird combination of the Dunlap broadsides, and then a month later, the Matlack engrossment kind of combined. So those are different things. Although it is, human nature and American nature to kind of combine them as one. Let's see. Yeah, 8 million. And what's really tricky is even more than copies of the Declaration, because there's only one copy that has signatures on it. These are just the broadsides that went out. Cat's coming in. But what we actually generally think about is losing our train of thought. 25, 8 million. Oh, to get the signatures, I think there's only 39 collections of the signatures of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So most signatures are actually fairly affordable. My parents, when I graduated college, got me Roger Sherman's signature, for example. Because back then they used to not only sign all of their letters, but Roger Sherman was a store owner. So he would literally give out a receipt with his signature on it. I have a receipt of someone buying, I don't remember what, from his store in Connecticut. So he's extra affordable. But even people like Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, they signed so many things. It's like, yeah, I'll probably run you $1,000, but like $1,000 is not necessarily a lot for one of these major historical figures' actual autograph. But the reason there are only 39 copies is because one person only has 39 known existent signatures at all. And that person is Button Gwinnett, who dies in a duel about a year after the Declaration of Independence is signed. He dies in a duel with Lachlan McIntosh brigadier general in the Continental Army. Actually, Georgia was a crazy place at the time. um, but because he dies with only 30 known copies, that there are so Button Gwinnett actually has the third most expensive signature in the history of the world. I did learn this fact about 15 years ago, so it may have changed since then. Someone might have gone up on the list or down. But if I remember it correctly, it was Caesar, Cleopatra, Button Gwinnett. Those are the most expensive signatures in the world. So deal with that as you might. Anyway, as for Dunlop, all right, as I said, he ends up going on to be pretty successful in land speculation. But again, he's best known for the Dunlop broadsides, publishing the Declaration, but he also, as I said, published the announcement prematurely and got canned for it, that we were friendly with France. But then he was forgiven, and 10 years later, the initial copy of the United States Constitution. Forgive me. Got allergies for the first time in my life this year. So if there are any more questions, please throw them at me. But I will continue on with, excuse me. Okay, the Declaration of Independence. So I did a live video this week, you might have caught. If you didn't, go back and check it out, where I did, and it was over an hour going through each grievance of the colonists. I'm not going to do that again right now. Go ahead and check it out if you like. What I will do is, the article I published was actually, I wrote all the 27 grievances that the colonists had against the king and parliament. I did like a common layman's version, modern English version. So I'm going to very quickly, literally just run through in modern English so we can just get a feel, because, you know, it's still 4th of July week. So we'll pop through that real quick and then we'll carry on. Let me know if you have any questions. The one thing I want you to note is, remember, pay attention to where taxation without representation actually falls on this list. It's surprisingly far down the list. So, 1. The king refused to let colonists pass basic laws. He closed down colonial governments. He threatened to only pass laws if the colonists gave up their ability to participate in his government. He made representatives of the people meet at times and in places that were nearly impossible to get to. He shrugged off legitimate complaints. His disillusion of the governments prevented the correction of economic problems and left the colonies open for invasion. The king stopped the colonists from being able to attract new settlers to the colonies. He refused to appoint judges, hurting the rule of law. The judges that were appointed were paid by the king and therefore did what he wanted instead of what was right and fair. He made pointless offices as a reason to send people to North America just to give the colonists trouble. He gave dictatorial powers to generals that used the military to suppress cities. Boston. He filled the streets with a police force whose procedures they had no control over. The king worked with Parliament to create laws that were unconstitutional. Instead of putting soldiers in forts, I actually should correct this. I said they were stationed in homes. They weren't the Quartering Act. I want to note, we talk about quartering in people's homes. That is a common misconception. It's so common that I somehow let it slip, Freudian slip, when I was writing this article, and I only caught it now, and this is like the 4th time I'm reading through it. The Quartering Act didn't station people in people's homes. That's a common misconception. That never happened. The British Army tried to do it once in Albany before the French and Indian War, and the people of Albany did not let that happen. Albany, New York. So where they were stationed was any abandoned, or not abandoned, but unoccupied houses, barns, stores, any building that didn't have someone living in it, because they didn't want to piss off the people who were living in these places. They didn't want to hurt the colonists intentionally. Some of them did, but most of them didn't. Parliament large didn't. They felt like it was their duty to protect their subjects, or the king's subjects. Anyway, I gotta correct that. When those soldiers committed crimes, they were protected from punishment. The king and Parliament cut off trade with the rest of the world. They implemented taxation without representation, number 17. They took away the benefits of trial by jury. They made up crimes and took citizens all the way across the Atlantic Ocean just for trial. They set up Quebec with French laws while expanding its territory all the way into the Midwest, which seemed to be an example of what they could expect in the future. French law, aka lawlessness. They took the charters which the colonies created, took them away, ending the long tradition of colonists controlling their own affairs. They claimed control of all laws in all situations. The king proved he was no longer the colonists' leader by starting a war against them. The war destroyed local communities. He hired a bunch of Germans to come to North America and kill his own subjects. He captured citizens and forced them to fight against their friends and family. He turned people against themselves, and he convinced Native Americans to attack the colonists. That's as brief an explanation as you are going to ever see on the internet. And I'll prove that by sending you over to my live video from last Sunday, where it was significantly longer than that. Excuse me. Although I do go through the actual... I think I read every word of the Declaration along the way, so that was fun. Why do that every year? Why not? Any questions or anything, let me know. Again, I did that whole video. I go into length on a lot of this, talk about how many of the things on this list are very similar to many of the things we're talking about in our reviews of the Anti-Federalist papers each Friday. 10 years later, during the constitutional ratification debates, you hear a lot of these same things coming up. And again, out of the 27, taxation without representation was further down the list. I will say again that there is a hint of propaganda in the Declaration of Independence, and that's one of the reasons that drops down. And the things that are up top are generally the first like 6 or 7 of them are all about laws, making laws. We want to make laws. We want to have the law. This is lawlessness, Your Majesty. Help us out with some laws. Let us make our own laws. And no, that's not what was happening in their perception. I'm going to move right along. Again, if you have any questions, I could talk about the Declaration of Independence for quite some time, as you might imagine. We're going to move on to someone totally random. The day after 4th of July, I was like, should I do another 4th of July person? I was like, no, let's just do something random. And I went with Francis Otway Byrd. Now, Francis Otway Byrd should have been a loyalist. He wasn't, but he should have been. He comes from 2 of Virginia's wealthiest families. Oh, before we move on, I see Nick over here with a Q. Did John Adams, Ben Franklin, Robert Livingston, and or Roger Sherman dictate or suggest to Thomas Jefferson on how or where the complaints should be at? No. Dictate, certainly not. Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston, future Chancellor of New York, were both on the Committee of 5, as you are implying, that was charged with drafting the Declaration of Independence. Now, at the time, drafting the Declaration of itself wasn't actually considered that important a task. They were more concerned with getting the votes to declare independence at the time. They also were more concerned with, people like John Dickinson. At the same time they decide to write a Declaration of Independence, they also decide to write a declaration, what became the Articles of Confederation, a government. And they also, that same day, the third thing they did was write, I forget the title of it, but a draft to other nations for their support. Like France, basically. Someone write a plea to France. You see John Adams and Ben Franklin overlapping on some of these committees, as they were certainly leaders of the Continental Congress. Thomas Jefferson had been there about a year. I mean, they left and came back, but he had been in the Continental Congress about a year. He essentially replaced George Washington. Jefferson at the time was very quiet. Most of his life was very quiet, but he was known as a pretty good writer. He had come to people's attention with a paper called A Summary View of the Rights of British Americans. I'm not going to get too deep into it. Basically, he wrote some laws that he wrote a resolution that he wanted Virginia government to pass. Virginia's government did not pass it, but some of his friends in the government, without his knowledge, published it, and it became known as a summary review, and it went wildly popular in the American colonies. And that's how Jefferson's name kind of got out there. So Jefferson's there. He's appointed this committee. Everyone kind of expects either Franklin or Adams to write it. Adams as one of the leaders, or Franklin as just, he was Poor Richard. Everyone else at the Continental Congress grew up reading Ben Franklin. just to put some context on it. Now, the Jefferson, again, writing the Declaration itself at the time didn't seem like the monster achievement it would become, like that we look at it now. But it obviously was very, it was needed. Jefferson, as someone who has a pen, there's a famous quote of Adams saying, Jefferson, I don't remember the quote exactly, paraphrasing it, Jeff, you're a better writer than I am. Go for it. And Jefferson does. And part of the reason the Declaration became so important is because it is so well written. Now, as for the list of grievances, I am not aware of anyone really telling Jefferson about the grievances. Most of the complaints were pretty well established by everyone, and it was just about listing them out. As I said, though, they did tell him what to take out. When the Declaration, independence is declared July 2nd, not July 4th, July 2nd. And when independence is declared on July 2nd, there is, they are all like, a little hushed for a few minutes, really thinking things over. And then they go into debating the announcement to the world that we have to, hey, guess what, guys? Guess what we did? We declared independence. And they spend July 2nd, all of July 3rd, and most of July 4th going line by line through the Declaration of Independence, removing, as I said, about a quarter of the original document. I suggest you look it up. Read the original Declaration of Independence. It's really interesting what was taken out. But they go back and people are popping in, so I am actually going to bring this back. Welcome, anyone popping in, talking about the Declaration of Independence. It's fun. So they don't tell Jefferson what to put in the Declaration of Independence, but the Continental Congress as a whole tells him what to take back out. Again, quiet Jefferson sitting in the corner, pulling his hair out. But no, truth be told, I'm under the impression that Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston have almost no participation in this particular document. It is famously, Franklin and Adams do come in and they do some wording adjustments at the beginning, but not in the heart of it. Adams himself doesn't seem to want to change anything at all. Ben Franklin, being poor Richard, has a few things to adjust, but on the whole, it's pretty much Jefferson's work, minus what the Continental Congress had removed for a wide variety of reasons. They do, I will note, after Franklin and Adams look it over, they do bring it to the whole committee. They are gentlemen, and they are not going to not bring it to the committee. And Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston seem to have read the Declaration, said fine, and Robert Livingston leaves almost immediately. As with many people in the days after independence was declared, many people at the Continental Congress ran home because, again, the United States did not declare independence. The United Colonies did. And suddenly, there were 13 independent states. And as I noted when we did the live stream last week, they refer to the state of Great Britain in the Declaration of Independence because they use the word state as in country, as in nation. So these 13 states were separate nations. So many people who voted for independence run back to their home state to help start their nation. And the Continental Congress, unfortunately, becomes kind of a side note at that point. It's kind of a stepping stone job for some younger guys, which is why you see later on people like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, young men, late 20s, early 30s, going to the Continental Congress, realizing that you can't even get a quorum, can't get anything done, and that's why the Constitution later is developed. But Robert Livingston is one of these people who runs home. Roger Sherman is one of those statesmen who stays in Philadelphia for essentially the entire Revolution. He's famously the only guy to sign all 4 major documents of the American Revolution, including the Continental Association after the First Continental Congress, of course, the Declaration, Articles of Confederation, and United States Constitution. Roger Sherman is a favorite of this channel, even though he seems to be cold and angry. And I will note, at the Constitutional Convention, Sherman ends up being one of the most frequent speakers, despite not being a good speaker, and despite being one of the oldest people in the room. After Franklin, he's second oldest. So Roger Sherman's a fascinating guy. I should make another video on him because he's one of the first videos I did like almost 2 years ago, and my early videos are not so great. They get a lot of hits and people click off them right away. Let's see. Anyway, problem is my earlier videos, I'm trying to be all studious and sound like a history person, and now I'm like, now that I have fun, people seem to like it more. Okie dokie. So, great question. Great question. Francis Otway Byrd. So, again, moving on to another founder. For anyone popping in, we are reviewing the videos slash articles I've published in the past week. The founders of the day from the last week. We're just having a chat. If you're new here, definitely subscribe. I put out a video every single morning about a different American founder, and this is the time to ask any questions you have. We also play trivia on Fridays. That's a lot of fun. Francis Otway Bird is a weird bird, if I can say that. Too soon? Too dad jokey? Anyway, Bird comes from, first of all, the Bird family. His great-grandfather, William Byrd I, was extremely important in colonial Virginia, even participated in Bacon's Rebellion. His grandfather, William Byrd II, was an extraordinarily important person in the early 1700s in Virginia. He spent about 30 years, even though born in Virginia, 30 years back in London as Virginia's colonial agent to the crown. Now, that position would become very important. It's something Ben Franklin would go on to do for quite some time for several colonies and states. Byrd's father, William Byrd III, was arguably the first person to hold horse races in the future United States, and a degenerate gambler who spent most of the family's money. Now, his father did marry a woman whose first name escapes me, but she was part of the Carter family. The Carter family, one of the landed aristocracies of Virginia at the time of the American Revolution. Not a lot of Carters find their names on documents. They usually had George Washington's and even Lee's go do the things for them. Although I will say Carter Braxton does have his name on the Constitution, a relative of the chain, to my understanding. Now, this sets up Francis Otway Bird. Francis Otway Bird was told, you are going to get a gigantic inheritance as soon as your parents pass away, specifically as soon as your mother passes away. But if you want that money, you better join the British Navy. And he is all set up to join the British Navy when whammy, this 19-year-old hears that the American Revolutionary War is breaking out, and instead of joining the British Navy and getting a whopping big inheritance, he decides to go pop on over and join the Continental Army. Now, within 2 years of this event happening, and I will talk a little bit about his time in the Continental Army, he serves for about 3 years. While he's in the Continental Army, his father takes his own life. And the reason his father seems to take his own life is, as I said, he was a degenerate gambler who did bring horse racing to the United States, which you may or may not think is cool. I think it's pretty cool. Never been to a horse race, but I still think it's cool. He lost all the family's money. And because of his rising debts, that's why he takes his own life. And the question is for me that I was unable to determine, because Francis Otway Bird, this guy doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. This is kind of a nobody. I'm very proud of what I found on this particular article. It's the hard ones that are fun. Bird, I could not determine if he joined the Continental Army because he knew his father had squandered his inheritance, or if he really believed in his efforts. But either way, he goes to the Third Virginia Convention. And the Virginia Conventions, when the colonial governors shut down the colonial governments, several colonies handled it different ways. Some of them set up these committees / conventions to be shadow governments to take over. And Virginia did this. They called them conventions. They had 5 of them. The third one, Francis Otway Bird goes to and says, hey guys, I'm from this super wealthy family, although my dad kind of blew that. Can I join the Continental Army as an officer? And they went, yeah, go be an aide-de-camp to General Washington. And Virginia sends him to North, because this is just as George Washington's getting to Boston. And they're like, yeah, oh, Washington's looking for anyone he can get his hands on. He gets sent up there. He doesn't actually work for Boston. He works for number 3 in the Continental Army, second ranking Major General, Charles Lee. And he works for several years for Lee as an aide-de-camp. Pretty successfully serves in just a bunch of different aspects of the war, notably the first siege of Charleston early in the war. Lee runs from Boston down to Charleston, then back up and meets Washington at New York. I want to say real quick, though, it's quite a trip on horseback. By the time, eventually, Francis Otway Bird is promoted to a lieutenant colonel and is in command of the 3rd Continental Dragoons, which Dragoons are kind of like cavalry, but they don't fight on horseback. They ride on horseback and then get off the horse to fight and then get back on the horse. I don't know the procedure of what you do with the horse while you're not on it, but that is how Dragoons worked, to my understanding. I don't believe Dragoons are a popular form of military unit any longer, at least not in the Western world. Now, as I said, Francis Byrd, his dad kills himself during this time. Um, and he ends up resigning the Continental Army to go help his stepmother, who was the one he was really waiting to pass away to get this inheritance. He goes to help his stepmother take care of all these debts his father left. Now, he is actually appointed sheriff of Charles City County. At the time, there weren't police forces. There was a sheriff who, when he needed to, would call out the posse comitatus, which is actually something we're make sure you like and subscribe, because tomorrow morning I'm releasing a video on the third federal farmer, and the federal farmer actually complains about the fact that the Constitution doesn't reference having a posse, which I was a little surprised at, because when I think posse, I think Wild West, Red Dead Redemption 2. What's up, guys? And apparently it was a thing. I always assumed they just called out the militia. Now, it's kind of the same thing. The militia would drill, and if you called out the posse, if you called out, which is just members of your community to help you enforce a law, most of the people you'd probably call on were in the militia with you. So it's a little two in one hand, half dozen in the other, or whatever the saying is. Now, he's, as I said, spends 20 years as sheriff of Charles City County. For whatever reason at the time, Virginia had a bunch of blank city counties, so the county would be named after a city. I'm not going to get hung up on it, but it bothers me. He also spends years as the clerk of his county, and when the Whiskey Rebellion breaks out, Byrd actually jumps in as a quartermaster general for the troops of the Virginia militia, and he goes out with Washington and the biggest army ever personally led by a president to suppress a rebellion whose the Whiskey Rebels may or may not have been justified. Depends on if you're a good person or not. No, I'm just kidding. But if you're looking at it objectively, they weren't really rebels. They were just people who were kind of getting real screwed over by their government right after the government was created. So there's that. Not going to get into the Whiskey Rebellion right now, but Francis ends up going on to become his last and longest job. He's appointed by President John Adams as customs collector for the port of Norfolk, which meant he was covering a gigantic amount of imposts coming in from arguably the most important port in Virginia at the time, which was pretty clearly the most important state at the time. Sadly for Byrd, he passes away shortly after that at just 44 years old. But again, really interesting guy, really interesting family story. So that's why I was fascinated with that. Now we're going to do another Francis. I just realized when I was setting this up, I accidentally did 2 Francises in a row, which is not something I considered. Excuse me. I will find myself doing consecutive Johns pretty frequently. That doesn't surprise me at all. But Francis was actually a pretty common name back in the day. I've learned. Let's talk about this one, Francis Mallory. Francis Mallory is another gentleman who there is just not a lot of information about, especially his early life, because he was kind of a low-level guy who worked his way up in the militia. Now, okay, you know how I just said they were in Charles City County? Well, Francis Mallory was from Elizabeth City County in Virginia. Really, I'm just putting together, that's where I saw the other one. So 2 Francises in a row, 2 mentions of a blank city county in Virginia. All right, let's continue on with the actually interesting stuff. Mallory's story is fascinating. He is essentially, spoiler alert, a martyr. Excuse me. Mallory, the war breaks out. Again, he's not a very well-known character, but he is appointed a colonel in the Elizabeth City County militia at the onset of the war. His experience is fairly quiet. Again, militias generally were supposed to stay within their state. They were rented out, essentially, to the Continental Army from time to time. That would make them known as a levy. But mostly their job was to stay within their state. And a man who signed up for the militia was not enforced that he had to leave his state. You could say no. And this actually goes on and becomes a problem in the War of 1812. Additionally, but if you were commanded to leave your state by your militia colonel, you could say no, because the militia was supposed to defend the home. That's the point of a militia. So he is appointed colonel. He hangs around in Virginia. There's not a ton going on in Virginia for a good portion of the war until 1780, when Mallory is actually captured by the enemy, and he is held in pretty terrible conditions on a British prisoner ship. Now, he is eventually released in a prisoner exchange, and this is a common story. You've probably heard me talk about it. I want to say Isaac Hayne had a similar story the last about 2 or 3 months ago we talked about. And the story goes that he was released in a prisoner exchange, and the deal was, we will let you go if you promise not to join the fight against us again. You go home, be with your family, but shut your mouth. And Mallory is one of the many people who said sure, and then went immediately back to his unit, and again took charge as a colonel of his division. I want to say regiment, but he didn't have that many people. Generally, with the Continental Army, a colonel would have about 1,000 people under his command. In the Virginia militia, I'm not exactly sure of the particular numbers. What I do know is the story I'm about to tell you. His numbers are significantly less than that. So he goes back. He assumes command of the Elizabeth City County militia, and he generally spends the following year, 1781, doing raiding, little skirmishes, brief raiding parties, trying to gather supplies and intelligence for the Patriots. Unfortunately, he runs into the Battle of the Skirmish at Waters Creek, it becomes known as. Tompkins Bridge. I see you, Ashley. I'll get there in just a second. Tompkins Bridge is a bridge over Waters Creek in Virginia. Mallory hears that there are British coming in his direction. So he takes his unit of about 20 to 60 men, and they're going to go destroy the bridge. And then when the British realize the bridge has been destroyed, they are going to ambush them. He sends 2 scouts ahead. Unfortunately, the British are further ahead than they realized and have much greater numbers. And for whatever reason, the scouts are scared away and don't ever return to Mallory. I'm unable to determine why, if they were captured or if they just wussed out and ran away, not sure. But Mallory does not get the word that they have already crossed the bridge. Mallory is leading his men to destroy this bridge, and they are already on this side of it. So they eventually run into the British. Not ideal, because the British have much greater numbers. I don't remember the exact numbers. I want to say it was like 40 to 60, and yeah, okay. So Mallory had 40 to 60 men, and the British had about 400 men. So 100 to 1 numbers. So when they meet up, it immediately goes awry, and there is a fight, and Mallory orders a hasty retreat, but he stays there to try and defend his men, so his men can retreat, and essentially sacrifices himself to keep his men alive. But at that point, one of his friends, Jacob Ray, actually hears the battle from his farm and comes over to see what's up. And he sees Mallory. Ray rides out into the fight and says, "Mallory, get on my horse." And Mallory says, No, I'm staying here to help my men. And he actually sends Jacob Ray away, which Ray leaves. As the fight takes place, as this is going on, some of the British soldiers recognize Francis Mallory as that guy that we pardoned last year and was not supposed to be fighting. And that makes them extra mad. Also, I should note that somehow this small group of American soldiers, they're able to kill 2 British officers and wound 2 more. So 4 officers are down. And then they see Mallory as the guy who was not supposed to be there, and everyone turns their attention at him. And he is killed pretty quickly. He's shot immediately. He goes down. The British trample him with their horses, and then, just for good measure, bayonet him a bunch of times. What the family heirloom is his jacket, apparently, and there are 11 stab wounds in the jacket, as the story goes. And that's the story of Francis Mallory. Again, that's his last, the skirmish at Water Creek, sometimes called the skirmish at Tompkins Bridge or the Battle of Tompkins Bridge. And it's tragic. It's a very small battle. There are hundreds of small battles that we know very little about. And this is just one of those really fascinating stories. So I do see Ashley with a question. Did they have any way of ensuring the prisoners they let go keep their promise and not fight again? No. Pretty simply, Ashley, no, unfortunately not. Um, they, the people at the time, especially men at the time, were men of their word, and they were supposed to be honorable. And generally, they assumed you would keep your honor, because what could be more disgusting, they would think, than someone going back on their word? That's something you fought a duel over. You keep your word, man. You keep your word. Be cool about it. Why are you not being cool about it? But again, especially in the southern states, you actually see this kind of often. The British are raiding and taking so many people, they don't really have the ability to hold on to them. It's not like up in New York in the north where they have all these ships to put people on. They have the whole city of New York to stash people in. There's not as much of an ability to hold prisoners in the south. It's one of the reasons that you do see them releasing soldiers. But again, you also see a lot of people in the south saying they would not fight and then fighting anyway. No, great question though. But no, because once you let someone go back then, there's no internet, there's no phones, there's no animal tracking devices. You just, bye. See you never, probably. But that is a great question. Excuse me. Oh, man. First year with allergies. I don't know how to deal with it. Okie dokie. Let's move along here. Tapping Reeve. So, Tapping Reeve is a fascinating person. I am really surprised it took me this long to actually write about him. Reeve actually is from Brookhaven, New York. Actually, I believe you've mentioned you're from Long Island, so whammy. Guy from Long Island, grows up there. I'm from Brooklyn, not Brooklyn, Brookhaven, New York, the township of Brookhaven. Actually from Medford, but whatever. The town of Brookhaven. Tapping Reeve is born there. His father is a deacon and makes enough of a living and educates him well enough to send Reeve to Princeton. At the time, it was called the College of New Jersey. Today, we know it as Princeton University. Reeve goes there and he studies under this headmaster, a man named Aaron Burr Sr. That name definitely sounds familiar to you because Aaron Burr Sr. is the father of Aaron Burr Jr. And Aaron Burr Jr. would be Vice President of the United States. More famous as the guy who won a duel against Hamilton, and yes, he won that duel. But he should be more famous as the third Vice President of the United States. The reason this is important is Tapping Reeve studies. People don't realize Aaron Burr's father was the president of Princeton before he passed away. Tapping Reeve studies under him, and while he's studying under Aaron Burr Sr., he goes on to teach at the Associated Grammar School. Most universities and colleges at the time had at least some kind of school for local school children. Reeve taught at that school, and among those school children were Aaron Burr Jr., and he educated Aaron Burr Jr. as a child and Aaron Burr's sister Sally. After he graduates, Reeve goes to Connecticut where he studies law, becomes very good at law, and starts to do what many lawyers did at the time for some side income, took on an apprentice. First he gets married to his former student, Sally Burr. So he marries into the Burr family. And Aaron Burr, Vice President Aaron Burr, is this guy's brother-in-law. Oh, by the way, Aaron Burr also goes to Princeton, and when he graduates, he goes to Connecticut to study law under Tapping Reeve. So Tapping Reeve literally taught Aaron Burr as a child, and then taught him law as a law student. Now, Reeve gets pretty good at this, and he keeps taking on apprentices, and he gets really good. And he would make his career teaching really the first generation, or really the second generation of Americans leaders, the law. And his effect, and we're going to get into this, but his effect on the law of the United States is impossible to underestimate. But before we get into that, I will say the Revolutionary War breaks out just after Aaron Burr comes along. Reeve teaches, he's studying law. He does want to join, he supports the Patriots. He joins briefly the Connecticut militia, but then he resigns very quickly because his wife, Sally Reeve at this point, is pretty sickly most of her life, and she does die pretty young, but he spends the war trying to take care of her. He does help with recruitment and such through the war. Now, he makes a real name for himself in the early 1780s. Famously, as I said in the video this week, Theodore Sedgwick was a Massachusetts lawyer who takes on the case of Elizabeth Freeman, better known as Mum Bet or Bet. She was a slave in Sheffield, Massachusetts. She hears a reading of the the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which was Massachusetts' second attempt at creating its first constitution. That one successfully goes through. She hears a reading of it, hears the phrase, all men are free and equal, and says, well, does that include all of us? And Theodore Sedgwick goes on to prove, yes, it does. And the reason this is important to Reeves is Reeves has established himself as such a lawyer in Connecticut that Theodore Sedgwick asks him to come join his council in Massachusetts. So he goes to a different state and helps prove, hey, you guys already outlawed slavery. And, in the final judgment by Chief Justice of Massachusetts, William Cushing, Massachusetts had already accidentally outlawed slavery, and he helps prove that. Of course, Massachusetts did not have the same type of slavery as they had in the South. There was just very few families had more than one or two slaves, and most families didn't have any. It was not as common as in other states or colonies. We're not going to get too much into a slavery debate now. That's not the point here. The point here is that this case brought real attention to Tapping Reeves, who had already been training people in the law for a while. Aaron Burr is making quite a name for himself as a politician, and he quickly, by 1784, becomes so popular as a law teacher that he actually has to build a second building on his property to help house his students and his library and give these lectures. And Litchfield, Connecticut, where he lives, it eventually becomes known as the Litchfield Law School. Generally, it was Tapping Reeves, going to Tapping Reeves School, but it becomes known as the Litchfield Law School. It's kind of a boom for his community because all these students are coming, living with his neighbors and paying them rent. Usually, at the time, if you were going to law school, you had some money. And so Reeves makes a real name for himself in this field. I'm going to go back in a minute and talk about some of his students, but over the ensuing 14 years, he becomes so important. He brings in another guy, Gould. I forget Gould's first name. I will have to remember his first name. James. James Gould is one of his many students, and James Gould comes on and becomes essentially his number two, and basically his employee, because I said 14 years because in 1798, Reeves is appointed to Connecticut's Supreme Court as an associate justice. And at that point, Gould does about 50%, maybe even more of the educating for Reeves, even though it's at his house. Literally, it's his house and the building outside his house where the school is. Now, Reeves continues in this position until I believe it was 1812. He is promoted to Chief Justice of Connecticut's Supreme Court. He then continues on being Chief Justice and running the school until 1720, when he retires and gives complete control of the school to James Gould. And Reeves will pass away a few years later. Now, in 1723. Now, Gould keeps the school going for another decade, and it closes in 1833, just a year shy of 50 years. Now, in these 50 years, and I should have brought it up. Tapping Reeves, yeah, he's already so. In these 50 years, let's go to the Wikipedia page because I forgot to pull up my own copy. In these 50 years, he helps educate two vice presidents, Aaron Burr being the first, and later John C. Calhoun, who, that's a questionable character, but still, John C. Calhoun goes from South Carolina to Litchfield, Connecticut to study law under Tapping Reeves, to indicate how important Reeves was. And then Calhoun goes on to be part of the great triumvirate, as they call them, in the second generation of American leaders. He also educates 101 members of the House of Representatives, 28 United States senators, 6 cabinet secretaries, 3 justices of the United States Supreme Court, 14 state governors, 13 state Supreme Court chief justices, as well as a wide variety of business leaders, university presidents, this and that, artists, people of all sorts of natures. Included in this list are those 2 vice presidents, Oliver Wolcott Jr., who goes on to take over for Alexander Hamilton as the second United States Secretary of the Treasury, continuing his Hamilton's financial plan, which is so extraordinarily complicated that most founders can't even explain it, let alone me trying to tell you about it. Again, I have tried, I will try more in the future, but not right now. A bunch of the Roger Sherman's grandkids, the Bacons, a bunch of Ellsworths, a bunch of Clintons, not the modern Clintons, but like the Governor George Clinton and the son of DeWitt Clinton, future Buffalo mayor. The list goes on, and I'm not just going to sit here and read the list for the rest of the night, but mark my words, I could literally sit here and just read you the list for the rest of the night. It is an extraordinary list. It's over 1,100 people, which might not sound like a lot of students considering our education system today, but at a time where you were either learning from Tapping Reeve or his guy James Gould, those two people in 50 years educated 1,100 leaders of the second generation of American leaders, having an extreme impact on the development of the law in the United States from the Aaron Burr had a pretty big impact too, but Burr again was a very early one. Burr stopped training about 10 years before they built the school itself, that extra building. So Burr was kind of like a warm-up gig to learn how to be a teacher. Again, I've got to harp on this point is, American history from 1810 until the Civil War, maybe 1820, the Civil War, that whole generation, the whole Jackson age, before and after, the leaders, some of the most important people, had studied the law under Tapping Reeve. So now that I've really driven that home and bored the living life out of you, let's move on. Well, of course, you have questions. We're going to bounce over to our last founder of the week, aka of today. I'm going to I have to turn off my AC when I start. I wear the flannel to keep up appearances, but it's starting to get pretty hot in here, so I'm going to sip my water. Quick sip of water. Hopley Eaton. I think it's pronounced Hopley. I have seen it pronounced as Hopley. I pronounce it Hopley, which I assure you is wrong because I usually default to the incorrect version, but that's how I read it. Because, right, it's two consonants, but an L followed by an E is still hop. Anyway, or hope. Yeah, okay, now I've confused myself. As you can see next to me, Hopley Eaton is considered the father of the American Coast Guard. Now, leading up to the American Revolution, Eaton went to sea as a boy. He was from New Hampshire. He goes to sea as a boy. By the time the Revolutionary War breaks out, he's made his way up to captain of a ship. It's a merchant ship that trades in all sorts of things. I'm not familiar with what he's trading. We could probably safely assume there were probably some slaves on there. I should probably throw that out, though I don't know. But he was a successful merchant ship, so that indicates he probably had some slaves at some point on his boats. That being said, when the Revolutionary War breaks out, he takes that ship and he becomes a privateer. And he wants to, he goes out hunting British ships. He does that for a little while before officially joining the Continental Navy. For everything I've seen, he serves with distinction throughout most of the war, not all of it, most of the war, on Continental Navy as a captain of a Continental Navy ship. He impresses George Washington enough that when the war ends, 1780s go on, and then the Constitution's written and ratified. George Washington becomes president. He brings in Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton makes this fancy financial plan, among which is creating the Revenue Marine. Because, believe it or not, there was a bit of a problem with smuggling. Alexander Hamilton came up with this great constitution, and we're going to start taxing imports, because that way we can make money for the federal government. And then he realizes what King George realized. This one here is Bobby. So he realizes what King George realized, and that is that the Americans like to smuggle. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Johnny Hancock. Although Hancock wasn't smuggling anymore at this point, but you get my point. Americans really like to smuggle because they don't pay their taxes. Still, many of us still don't. Anyway, Yeaton is contacted as when they create the Revenue Marine. This is essentially what we would consider the Coast Guard today, except they weren't called out on life-saving missions. Fast forward to the future, there is another organization established called the Life Savers. I think, where is it? I have it written here. I want to get the name of it right. And of course, now I can't find it. It combines with the Life-Saving Service. There it is. In the early 1900s, the 19-teens, about 100 years ago, the Revenue Marine and the Life-Saving Service come together and create the Coast Guard. The Life-Saving Service comes much later. First, they're worried about money, and they create the Revenue Marine. Revenue Marine is about 13 ships, I believe it was, that were called cutters. Now, cutters were supposed to cut through the water. They were supposed to move really fast. They weren't supposed to travel the oceans. They weren't supposed to be warships. They weren't supposed to even be whaleboats. They were just supposed to move along the shores very fast so that if a smuggler was seen, they could get there real quick and be like, "We see you, pull over." You know, like a water cop. And that's essentially what they did. Now, the cutters, instead of getting a captain, were given a master. Same thing, just a different title for the boat, for this new revenue marine. And again, marine, kind of like Marines. They're doing something very similar to what we'd expect from the Marines. So, except this is for stopping American ships who are smuggling as opposed to going to foreign shores. Yeaton is the first person George Washington appoints as a master of a cutter, making him the most senior master of any cutter in the revenue marine. He does this successfully for several years. Then John Adams becomes president and starts having these problems with Democratic Republicans, realizes that even though he's from New Hampshire, which is generally Federalist, hopefully Yeaton sees himself as a Democratic Republican. And therefore, Johnny Adams says, "Get out of here, bud." And he gets laid off. Luckily, just 2 years later, Tommy Jeff steps in as president, and Thomas Jefferson says, "Well, remember what a good job Yeaton was doing. Let's get him back there." And he does. He brings him back, and Yeaton then serves for about another, I think it was 12 years by the last founder. Of course, I published this one today, but I've forgotten because I went through all these other founders. He serves for about 12 years until he retires to private life. He made he was a great call for this job because he had not only served with the Continental Navy and knew what it was like to be fighting at sea, but he'd also spent so many years as a merchant. So he understood what merchants were doing. He understood how merchants, especially smugglers, operated in the area. Just a great guy for this job. He's also really well known for recommending the creation of a school, the Coast Guard Academy. Now, the idea was, hey, look, we got West Point over here that just at the time got created to train soldiers. Why don't we have a school for training people in the Navy? And he helped initiate this type of education. Eventually, it became what is today's Coast Guard Academy. And his dual role as the main proponent of a school for seafaring soldiers, as well as being the first master of a cutter in the Revenue Marine, is why generally the Coast Guard itself looks at Hopefully Yeaton as the father of the American Coast Guard. And that's it for this week. If you have any questions, now's the time to let me know. I will take a sip of water while I wait patiently, and then I'll say thanks for showing up. Hey guys, thanks for showing up. This is a lot of fun. It's always fun chatting with you guys, wrapping up my week, being a little bit more casual. TJ, just in time for the end. Well, you can rewind. If you had any questions, again, I'm wrapping up the videos from this week, so if you had any questions about any of the videos I put out this week, let me know. I will say, most of the people who watch these videos, watch my live videos, which is awesome, but I do also put out really brief. I try and keep them under 5 minutes. Sometimes they run a little long. I think it was the Mallory one ran a little bit long. Oh no, it was the Reeves one was long this week. But every morning at 8 o'clock, not only do I send out an email with my article, but I also put out a video that has a link to the article every morning. So the YouTube algorithm isn't, if you're watching live videos, probably won't tell you I'm putting out these videos every single morning unless you watch one or two of them. So if that interests you, a brief recap, watch one or two of them tonight. And then hopefully that'll recommend tomorrow's and the next days, and every day you'll get a little recommendation. How super nice would that be? YouTube's tough like that, but you know, if you want, they're on here for you for free. I'm making them for you. So additionally, this wrap up is about the videos I put out the last week. So if you'd rather not spoil this video, I understand that. We're going through all the same information, but if you want to watch those and maybe have any questions on this, I do a little bit more elaborate because I have the articles in front of me. I can take the time to look things up if we have to. I'm not in a rush to get it done in 3 minutes or 5 minutes. We can take our time generally, but we have actually surpassed an hour, which I'm a little surprised because, as I said, we're actually one founder short, but it's Declaration of Independence week. That usually runs a bit long. Thank you, TJ. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Nick. And thank you, everyone else who came. Misfit, I think I saw you pop in for a second there. Thank you, absolutely everyone. It is the weekly wrap-up. I knocked my arm off the chair. It is round bottom day. So thank you, guys. I'll be back with trivia for you tomorrow. So come for that. And other than that, you have a great night and round bottom.